Today we're going to discuss it's just going to be all words, a new topic that has come to my attention as being a bit more of a problem than I perceive. This is probably largely the fact to do that I change my strings often, but I'm also a finger player, and this is because I play guitar. I'm like a bass player because I'm first and foremost a bass player. So these issues don't necessarily affect me as much as you guys do. And that issue is strings breaking. Just within this last month, I've had about 3 different people come up to me with their strings breaking, needing help in that moment because they're trying to get to play their song, but their string just broke. And so I wrote down a few topics that I'm going to cover, and we're going to start with the reasons why your strings might break, and then we'll wrap up the video by discussing and explaining how we can work to avoid those issues and keep our strings from breaking. So to start off with, the first topic of our strings breaking, one of the issues that we can look at as being a reason is temperature change. And before you go like, hey, like metal can actually take a large range of temperatures, this is very true, but your instrument does not. So if you sit and you let your car, you leave your instrument in your car during the winter, it's going to get pretty cold. You leave your instrument in the car during the summer, it's going to get pretty hot, right? And wood has the ability to change because wood is not 100% dry. So water inside of that wood is allowed to make the fibers expand, contract, do all kinds of different things. And so you'll notice that your neck may straighten or tighten or bow, right? And this is going to basically fluctuate constantly your string tension. So what's that going to do to your string? Well, if you think about it, continuously back and forth, tighten, loosen, is going to create a lot of stress on your strings. On top of that, it creates tuning issues for you later on during the day when you're actually playing it. So, we'll get into how to avoid that later on. The next topic, harsh playing. And this is probably actually one of the larger possibilities for players. If you play really hard, really harshly, what's going to happen is you're going to create basically like 3 different forces on your strings. Without going into all the fancy technical words for it, we're just going to look at kind of like a longitudinal, which probably isn't a word, longitudinal force, right? And that's just the tension on the string itself. You also have kind of like a lateral force as you're playing, the back and forth force, and then you have what's called shear force, and I don't really have a better word to use other than shear force, but that's the force of, let's say you had 2 pieces of wood that were screwed together, and then you pushed on one side of the wood down while the other side was trying to hold up. All the force that's on those 2 screws holding those pieces of wood together would be called shear, right? This force is shear. So those are 3 forces that are going to be placed on your string when you're playing. The harder you play, the more those forces are going to increase. And what's going to happen inside of the metal is you're going to create more and more basically like tiny micro stress fractures. In metal in general, there are micro stress fractures kind of already because metal is not crystalline. It's somewhere in the middle. It's not like glass. Glass is erratic, completely erratic. Diamond is crystalline, right? And both of those substances are actually very brittle, and so we can't use those for strings, but we can use metal because it's somewhere in the middle of those 2. The problem with that is the longer and the harder you play it, the more you're going to see those little stress fractures being created, and the more your metal starts to gain the properties of glass. Think about that. The more your string is like glass, obviously, the easier it's going to be to break. The next thing, and this is kind of based off the same thing, is age. Even if you are a gentle player, if your strings are super old, they're going to have a ton of stress fractures in them. And once again, this is going to make them more brittle and very easy to crack. But continuing off of that, and something that age has that just harsh playing doesn't, is that age you can have a bunch of oxidation on the outside of a string, and if you were to take your nail and like run it up the string and you end up with a bunch of black on your fingernail, well, now you know that string is pretty old, and this is going to happen pretty quickly. You can start to see black within 2 months. So it doesn't take a very long time for oxidation to happen. But oxidation makes your strings a little stickier on your fingers, a little stickier to the pick. And on top of that, just kind of adds to the brittleness of the string. And that's going to once again kind of work to increase your ability to break your string on accident. The next one is due to slipping right up here. So let's say I don't like have enough winding around my string. I can see the string actually visibly like slip out of the tuning machine, and then boom, I have this free string. It never broke actually, but it slipped out, right? And that's a problem. But we can also have bad tuners, and I've seen this more than once as well, where the bad tuning machine up here has like a really harsh edge, or there's just something weird going on with it, and it breaks it. And this is a lot of reason why people will purchase aftermarket tuning machines, like locking tuning machines or things like that, because they just don't want to deal with any issues that regular stock tuning machines might have. The next one is we have breakage at tuners. Once again, same location where the breaking is happening, but this time it's due to too much wrapping, or just like a bad wrap job or something. If you wrap the string too much, or if you kind of like all over the place with it, like sometimes it's under, sometimes it's over, and like you're kind of going back and forth with the string, you're going to create a lot of like tension in that area and a lot of weird stress angles, and then boom, broken string right at this angle. And so we're going to talk once again in the future about how to avoid this. And then the very last one is actually defects from the manufacturer. This is pretty rare, but I have seen this over my lifetime with all the strings I've had. Interestingly enough, mostly with bass strings. They'll actually come with a defect, and so you'll string it up and it basically immediately breaks. Why did it immediately break? It immediately broke because somewhere along the line, one of the cores or the wraps or something with the string was not like actually perfect, or it was broken in an area, and then boom, it just breaks super easy. And that's a defect from the manufacturer. So now we've talked about all the different possible ways that you can experience a cause of your strings breaking. So now let's talk about ways we can avoid those strings from breaking. So when we're talking about temperature change, this one's actually a very simple fix. And I recommend, regardless of if you're having strings breaking or not, to do this because it's nice to your instrument. It'll make it last a lot longer before you have mechanical issues, electronics issues, all these types of things. And that is just keep your instrument in a case, in a house, wherever you go. You will never see me leave my instrument outside in the garage, outside in my car. My instrument goes where I go. If I can't sleep there, then my instrument isn't sleeping there either. And so this is going to work to not allow a bunch of warping in my wood overnight, during the day in a hot car, whatever it is. And it's going to see a lot less stress on my strings. On top of this, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to reduce tuning issues because no longer is my wood warping back and forth, and needing to constantly come to a new equilibrium, right? If I keep it at basically always 70 degrees or so wherever I go, 65 at the lowest, 78, 80 during a hot day, right? That's the largest temperature fluctuation it's going through, and so it's not going to need as much time to get in tune. But if I'm allowing it to get to 130 degrees in my car, if I'm allowing it to get down to 45 degrees at night in my garage, you better believe not only is that going to cause a lot of stress on your strings, it's going to cause a lot of tuning issues. Now moving on. Stress. How do we work to avoid causing like physical stress on our strings? The first way is at how hard you're playing and trying to adjust how hard you're playing. Sometimes you just have to adjust it. Other times though, you'll see people playing extra hard, but that's because their amp is actually not loud enough. This is especially big for bass players, but this can happen for guitar players. If you're like, I just need to play a little harder so that way people can hear me. why don't you turn up your amp and play a little more gently? And this will work to reduce the stress on your guitar. Sometimes, though, guitar players like to play hard, and that's just part of their style. If that is part of your style, maybe try considering changing at least a little bit, trying to reduce the force you're putting on your strings, because if you are constantly laying into them and playing super hard, your broken strings are going to be a constant issue throughout your playing, and that's going to reduce kind of your liability as a guitar player for a band. If you go and you play a show and you can't get through the first set without a broken string every single show, your band is going to get fed up with that really fast. They're like, sorry, there's 9 million other guitar players out there in the world that I can hook up with and play on my band who want to be here, and they're not going to have all these broken strings like you do. So that's one thing to consider. If you're playing super, super hard all the time, consider that. You know, it might take a little bit of training and working on really trying to relax and play everything very gently, but it will help your tone in some cases, and it will reduce your string breaking. Next, getting a thicker string size. This is once again still on stress. If you like to play hard and you're not willing to change that, right, because it is part of your style, it sounds good with your instrument or whatnot, then consider upgrading to a thicker string size. This could just be like a 0.5. So if you play at a 9, maybe consider playing at 9.5. There won't be a big difference in tone or the feeling of your strings, but you will notice a reduction in your ability to break the strings. You might get like another 2 weeks out of a 9.5 than you would out of a 9, something like that. Okay, moving on to age. Okay, this one is probably even simpler than the temperature change way of fixing it. If your strings are breaking due to age, please just change them sooner. And I'll link a couple videos that I've made that talk about how you can identify if your strings are in fact too old. Next, slipping, right? So working to wrap your strings a little more, and once again I'll link to another video where I show you how much to wrap around each tuning machine. If you wrap them enough, they kind of hold themselves onto the tuning machine and they're not going to slip off. But also consistency in the wrap, right? Each layer should either go above the one before or below it. There are different times where you'll choose for your wraps to go below or above it. If you're up and down and up and down, you can get all kinds of weird issues. So kind of continuing right off of that, breakage, and this will be from wrapping it too much or not consistently enough. Once again, if you're wrapping up and down and up and down and up and down, cause weird stress angles on the string, and that is going to work to increase the chance that that string is going to break up here. On top of that, if you are wrapping it just way too much, you're going to see a lot of tuning issues. And on top of that, it's going to force you at some point to begin wrapping your string inconsistently, right? If your string is so long that it's starting to wrap over itself, it's way too long, way too long. None of your strings should ever wrap around itself again, ever, okay? Now, very last is working to avoid defects, getting defects from the factory in your strings. So the very first thing that I like to do when I'm stringing up a guitar is feel the string, the whole length as I go down. You can usually feel either like a large depression or like a large fat gap in the wrap of the string if there is a defect somewhere. I've seen this, like I said, is much more common in bass strings, but this can happen in guitar strings as well. So that's the first way. You can just feel it as you go down. Second way is giving your instrument a good hard couple of strums right after you first string it up. If something is going to break, it's from playing it, you know, because there's a defect, the first couple hard strums you do will break a defected string, and then you know, boom, my strings came with a defect, right? They should not be breaking within the first 3 strums that you do on your guitar. So don't just wrap up your guitar and then, oh, I'm done, you know, all my strings are on, they're brand new, and put it in my case and don't look at it until the next time I'm gonna actually play a gig. No, no, wrap it up, like, you know, get them all on there, tune it up, check your intonation, and then play a couple hard notes, and then see if anything breaks, and then you'll know before a show if anything was defective and you need to restring that string, right? Now, moving further from that, if you see a consistent issue in your strings where you're purchasing them from a company and consistently you're having strings that are breaking, might need to look at either changing the company or changing the string size. Probably more likely you'll be changing the string size, because most companies nowadays, especially if they're mainstream, if you can find them at Guitar Center or find them at a guitar store, then they're going to be a pretty reliable company that's not sending out a ton of defective strings all the time. However, it's been something that I have noticed in more than one pack of Diodario strings, and has made me kind of consider, oh, maybe I should move on to a different company. There are plenty of other companies out there, and, you know, something to consider. So take that into heart, you know, all this information, and if you are having strings breaking, think about all those factors. There is one last factor I forgot to mention, and it has to do with breaking of your strings back here. Okay, if you are playing really harshly, or if there is actually a piece of broken metal or a defect in these metal pieces on your bridge, they can work to cut your string in half right here, down here at the bridge, and that'll once again be another place that you can find a breaking of your string. If this is a problem, you probably should look at either replacing one of these metal pieces if there's like a little bit of damage to it, or taking it into a shop, because any damage or like weird cutting pieces of metal down here, they're just going to be a constant issue for you that you need to fix right away. So that's all the information I have. That I think covers just about every possible issue you could have with a string breaking on your guitar. Yeah, listed just about every single reason and ways of fixing them. All right, I'm going.